one of the great and often unsung successes of the 45 Labour government and the subsequent. So it's, I'm sure I should be welcoming you on behalf of the LGA as well. I'm sure who let us in here tonight. This morning, as every morning, as I came in, I came down Farringdon Road and passed the memorial plaque to the Memorial Hall, where, of course, on 27th of February 1900, which is just 22 years and 122 years, 8 days ago, the Labour Representation Committee was created. And now I'm sitting here in Transport House as was, which for my generation is full of memories. I think it was actually, it was just outside when we welcomed in May '79, Audrey and Jim Callahan, when they came in with 79 defeat to thank the staff and to say, farewell to Number 10 to what they were doing. And it was also, I think, in this very room where we used to have press conferences. You won't believe this, but in June 1973, I think I was probably here as a journalist at the time, I can't remember, and I witnessed our then General Secretary of the Labour Party, Jim Mortimer, at a press conference during the election to let people know that the NEC that morning had reaffirmed that Michael Foot was the leader of the Labour Party. So whether you think we're in despair, or recently you ain't seen anything. I say some of those things because the younger members of the audience who think you come here to hear some history, actually what you think of history, for some of us, is simply our lived experience. But today we're here to consider what I think of as one of the lost arts of political development, and that is the study and the understanding of our own history. Because while economics and political science and psychology and sociology all play a large part in how we analyse society and how we develop our policies, our solutions to problems, unless we understand the lessons of the past, what was tried and failed, and interestingly what was tried and succeeded, and the role of the structures we used, the role of personalities, and of external events, of how we govern, but sometimes fail to govern. If we don't learn the lessons of all of that, then our solutions for the next generation, I think, will be weaker and less effective than they could be, and our dreams just stay dreams. And that really is one of what we're doing is so important, is to make us look and learn from the past. And then, when I think of myself as a politician, or a political activist, if you like, maybe also because I am a historian, I draw a lot on the lessons from our past in thinking about how to frame the solutions and the way forward for the future, and to also remain grounded in the art of the possible, because it's no good having great dreams if actually there's no guarantee of reality. So it is 122 years on from the Memorial Hall meeting. But as Nick Thomas Simmons says in the book, I thought rather acutely, it's 100 years since we became the official opposition. So it is a time, I think, that we've asked, what are the lessons of that period? We've won just 8 elections in that 100 years, and only 5 of them with a majority in double figures. Nick Thomas Simmons, being a great optimist, says, well, the lesson is we can recover. Other authors, of course, look in the book about the commonality, if you like, of our victories. When did we win? We won when we were united, we won when we spoke for and with the trade unions. At the time I'm talking about when this was Transport House, of course, it was headquarters of TNG, not simply of the Labour Party. When we were in tune with voters' concerns, and when they felt that we understood them, and that our aspirations were their aspirations. and it was really touch and go whether we would get the NHS going. And the BMA boycott, basically, it was going to fall before it started. And quite a small group of Jewish doctors, some of whom had come over and with experience of Bismarck, who of course started as a welfare state, and understood what the national health service could look like. Others of them were GPs in their core areas and really understood. And they sort of found out around their local DNAs, and a crucial change in the DNA position was taken by some really, what we now call grassroots activists. So although the leaders have talked about it in the book, I think there are these other bits of history that we need to capture if we're to really understand things. The book also reminds us, if you like, the zeitgeist that there was around at different times. I was a bit shaken when I reread in Dianne's chapter these words. The sense of estrangement felt by many working class voters towards the party whose politics sometimes seemed to bear little relation to the realities of everyday life of ordinary people, and whose concern for permissive legislation, the arts, higher education, and they could not mask its failure to deal with housing, unemployment, and the cost of living. That wasn't written about the 2020s. That was John Guyford writing in 1971 about the Wilson years. So some of the things we look back on, of course, have seen quite differently, even at the time we see them. And that's, I think, what we'll find in this book. And looking back again at those Wilson years, crossing the wall that made us increasingly leadership, risk losing focus on our traditional supporters. And we talked about leaders who hardly ventured from London and who were deaf. Even then, it was saying to the issue of immigration. So, police are charged. Crossland was writing that then, and his preoccupation of trying to get a more classless society made him concentrate on that perennial problem of how to address harsh, specific, and unmerited inequality. And the reason for me that that's important to take out the Crossland view is that his words that carrying through a radical egalitarian program involving a major redistribution of resources is a formidable task. And I think there's one lesson that comes from all the chapters, which we've read. It is about the formidable task that we face. So since 1900, our members and our leaders have had common endeavour and ambition. They wanted election success in order to change things. And they needed the policies and what we would now call the agency to make it happen and then to get re-elected. And I think that calls for us to look at not just what happened, but how and why did our successes happen, as much as why did things go wrong. The book, I think it's your chapter, I can't remember, but the book also quotes Edmund Dell, and then I think, quotes Edmund Dell. The British governments have learned few lessons from history. Parties to continue to promise what they cannot deliver. And that seems to me really important for any party, that we don't just want to have promises, but we actually must have them, that they are then deliverable for the sake of trust in politics and all of that. Today, though, one of Nathan's quotes is, he calls the 1997 2010 as by far the most electorally successful, continuously sustained period of government in their history. Now we need to ask how and why we did that, but even more, how is it then possible that a whole group within the party then undermined that over the years since? We had such achievements and we were unable to stand with them. The book makes it clear it's hard work to make fundamental changes, but that actually is what brings us all together more today, and it's what the authors in this book address. And most two books, particularly today on International Women's Day, and the lovely biography of Alice Bateman, but also a book on women in Westminster, which she subtitles The MPs Who Changed Politics. Pretty good description. Congratulations.
To everybody involved in putting this book together, which I think is really timely as well as really good reading. And we do have to learn from our history so that we don't repeat the mistakes and so that we do things better and faster than we have in the past. Dianne mentioned some of my work about women in politics, and I think it is worth on International Women's Day celebrating some of the great achievements of some fantastic women in our party's history. Women like Ellen Wilkinson, who raised the school leaving age and introduced free school meals and free school milk. Barbara Castle, the Equal Pay Act and the first ever child benefit. Joan Richardson, who raised first of all the issue of domestic violence in Parliament. And of course, Tessa Jarrell and Harriet Harman, who were responsible both for tax credits in the last Labour government and also the introduction of Sure Start and children's centres. Women throughout our history have put issues on the agenda that had been neglected previously, and in doing so have changed the lives of women and all of us up and down the country. And you also mentioned Alice Bateman, who played her role in decriminalising abortion in the 1960s alongside Roy Jenkins and others. And for our Labour history and the battle for the heart and soul of the Labour Party, Alice's nickname, some of you may know, was the Terror of the Trotskyists. So pay tribute to Alice as well. There was a great chapter in the book by Krista Calman that looks at the advances of women in the party, not just nationally, but throughout all the structures of our party. And today, more than half of our MPs in the Labour Party are women, and more than half of our shadow cabinet are women. That would not have been the case without the work of Harriet Harman, Angela Eagle, Claire Short, and others in the Labour Party and also in the trade union movement to lift women up and to ensure that their voices were heard in the party. 100 years ago, there wasn't a single female MP in the Labour Party. When I was born just over 40 years ago, 19 of the 650 MPs were women, and today 221, I think it is now, since the election of Paulette Hamilton in the early hours of Friday morning are women. So huge change in our country, and so much of that has been led by the change in our party. I also want to talk about some of the other contributions to the book as well, and particularly Ben Jackson's, because Ben in his chapter talks about Labour's place within Britain's radical history. I think that's a really powerful resource for us to draw on as a party and our movement, because Labour have always challenged the status quo, but we've also been an important part of some of the key institutions that make us who we are today as a country. Keir Starmer has reminded us recently that the 1945 Labour government wasn't just responsible for the creation of the National Health Service, but also the creation of NATO. And if NATO wasn't invented today, it wouldn't need to be. But Ernest Bevin, Clement Attlee, and Myron Bevin played a huge role, and it's a pleasure to be in Bevin Hall today to make these remarks. So our place within our national story, both challenging the status quo, but also building some of those proud institutions that make us who we are today. And we should tell that story, a Labour story of nation building. But there are also some lessons in the book about how to win. And the truth is the history of the Labour Party doesn't include too much of that. We've had 3 big victories in our time as a party, in 1945, in 1964, and in 1997. And what binds those 3 moments together is that that was when Labour owned the future, when we looked hopeful that we loved the country that we wanted to serve, and showed people that that was the case. Now, I don't think we can go back and replicate those manifestos of 45, 64 and 97 and expect to win today. But there are lots of lessons from those experiences. How do we reassure people? We know some of our weaknesses as a party. People don't always trust us on national security, on crime and antisocial behaviour, or indeed in my area of trusting Labour with the public finances. So the first thing that an opposition needs to do to even be heard is to reassure people in those areas of weakness. Henry Attlee knew that, Major Attlee, as he named himself, or as he was going into that 1945 election. And so many of our Labour candidates going into that election, still in the uniforms that they wore to serve our country. In 1964, Harold Wilson knew that. And he also knew he had to own the future with that fantastic speech in 1963 that we still quote today about the white heat of technology. And Tony Blair and Gordon Brown knew that in 1997, where they reassured people on tax and spend, but also showed that they were the modern dynamic party compared to the outdated, actually this is similar to 64 as well, to the outdated Conservative Party that they took on in that election. Now the challenges that we will face at the next election are different from the challenges in each of those three occasions in the past, but there are important lessons to learn. On climate, on the fact that we no longer have the Cold War dividend that existed in the 1990s, and also on Britain's place in the world now that we are outside the European Union. Those are huge challenges that the country and the Labour Party, who wants that chance to govern again, has to grapple with. I think there are lessons we can learn from those previous experiences of winning. But most of all, what Keir Starmer, myself and the Labour team have got to do in the next 2 years is, I think, equivalent to what Neil Kinnock, John Smith and Tony Blair did in 14 years. I don't think that overstates the challenge. But what we have in this book are the resources to learn from and therefore shortcut that victory back to power. So I think this is essential reading for anybody who is serious about winning again, because if we learn those lessons from the past, then it will be the sooner that we get back into government and can shape this country for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, particular warmth response to that and your challenge. And next I'd introduce Jeremy Nuttall, who's a senior lecturer at Kingston and author of Psychological Socialism, the Labour Party Qualities of Mind and Character, and also co-editor of Making Social Democrats Essays for Labour Market. Jeremy, over to you.
I'm not so familiar and assured as Rachel is with this attack here. It's a difficult act to follow. And I've also got slightly more crumpled notes with me, impressed by Rachel's ability to add lead like that as well. I think actually Rachel and I, we knew each other about 20 years ago from the Oxford Labour Club. And I think this is the first time we bumped into each other since. It's funny how your world comes kind of round. My chapter in the book is about labour and aspiration, and so I'll just talk a little bit about what I say in the chapter. Essentially, make two kind of main points. One is to say that Labour has had a kind of historical problem with aspiration. I'm a historian contemporary historian by training, but the second is that there have also been crucial periods in Labour's history where it's kind of overcome that problem with aspiration, and to suggest therefore, partly by learning from history, but also addressing itself, as Rachel says, kind of to the contemporary situation, and not just within the past, it is possible for Labour to reclaim that association with aspiration. I think it's an important one to do. So the subject of aspiration has long been an uneasy one for Labour, and as both Dianne and Rachel were saying, the Labour Party on the whole has been electorally unsuccessful for much of its 122-year history, less successful than the American Democrats, less successful than the sort of equivalent Progressive Party of British Liberals in the 19th century. So aspiration and the association with aspiration, that ability to build a kind of cross-class national appeal, broad appeal, is not the only reason for those electoral shortcomings, but I think it's an important one that kind of academics across the board are increasingly acknowledging. Is something that both explains Labour's past and those electoral defeats and is important in thinking about the future. And we see this as something that affects kind of all wings of the party. I mean, it's sort of, there's probably a measure of agreement, I'm guessing, in this room about some of the ways in which the left of the party has struggled sometimes to connect with the sort of mainstream, but it's not just a thing of the left. If you go back to the 1950s, which is maybe the first era when concepts like aspiration and affluence first start to really come to the fore in political discourse. You hear it from Bevan, the way he dismisses gadgets and material things, consumer goods, that sort of growing consumer affluence in quite a dismissive way. But you also hear it from Gaitskell on the right of the party as well. So this is not just something that's afflicting the left of the party. And affluence and aspiration are seen often as a threat, I think, something to be kind of wary of, something almost other-like in the way that to deal with them. The centre-left could have appropriated this concept of affluence and aspiration. It doesn't necessarily need to be in a kind of narrow materialistic way. But as Lawrence Black has argued, by dismissing affluence and aspiration altogether, in a sense, the left contrives to alienate itself from the concept altogether. So I think the trick here is to take aspiration and affluence and to redefine it in more cooperative and progressive terms. So if there's an acceptance that there has been a problem in terms of aspiration, what are some of the reasons for it? And I discuss in the chapter some of those. I think class has certainly been a reason for it. And there's consistently this sense that aspiration and affluence are somehow other, whether materially beyond reach from the point of view of the party's kind of working class labourist culture. So this idea that, you know, aspiration and materially getting on is something that Labour can't say too much about, because it is a party that's essentially representing the dispossessed, rather than both the dispossessed and the aspirational. And I think also, in a way, the intellectual side of the party as well has been a bit sniffy about aspiration and affluence. And you can see this in the famous quote, from the famous quote from Sidney Webb in 1923, the leading famous Fabian, Dianne will know well, who denounces in 1923 the sinister dominance of the private interests of the owners of great masses of wealth. And it's this kind of Nuttall denunciation of the capitalist classes, not as Labour should always do, the identification of the problems of capitalism, the problems of greed, the problems of the wealthy, but this kind of unselective criticism of wealth on total, capitalism on total, that I think is the problem. And by the 1970s, you can see this, when you get this kind of newly expanding middle class culture really beginning to come to the fore, of course, provides the kind of basis for the electoral appeal of Thatcherism in the 1980s. And so that's when you get Spanish packaged holidays, televisions and freezers, and these things then, these cultural things begin to have political implications. And so I think class is part of it, and I think connected to this is the wider progressive kind of suspicion of suburbia, and that kind of geographical alienation from those kind of outer parts of the cities, which of course, you know, continues to be a problem today as well for Labour. So there is a lot of talk, of course, of the loss of the northern heartlands, the loss of Scotland and so on, but there is this third dimension as well, which hasn't gone away, which is the sort of the suburban middle. And that is still there as a section of the sort of geographical section that Labour, I think, still has an issue with. And you can see this kind of anti-suburbanism across the progressive community as well. It's evident in early century New Liberals. People like Leonard Hobhouse, for example, the leading New Liberal thinker, talks about feverish suburban hordes. There's talk of suburbia being a greater burden on the nation than the slum. You can see it, I don't know if anyone remembers the iconic Mike Leigh play in 1977, Abigail's Party, which kind of set the benchmark for the critique of the emerging suburbia, those famous characters, perhaps most famously the hostess Beverly, who played and the sort of insecurity, snobbery, and pretentiousness of that newly emerging middle class. Homeowners, computer operators, estate agents, and so on. And it's a brilliant drama, of course, and has stood the test of time, but almost entirely absent from it is a sense of countervailing suburban virtues, of the sort of virtues of those people who are aspiring to rise. So these are some of the different factors. Perhaps a final factor, trying to understand the sort of neglect of aspiration, is Labour's kind of traditional economic reductionism, the tendency to reduce problems to exclusively economic issues. And again, you get this across the party. It's not just the left. I mean, someone like Clement Attlee talks about everything coming down to economics. All the other centres of power in society are ultimately reducible to kind of economic solutions, economic things. But you can still see it today. A pamphlet published by the new left-wing think tank Class in 2015 went so far as to title itself Against Aspiration, on the grounds that aspiration is a rhetorical device that seeks to whitewash a neoliberal economic and political project and the staggering inequalities it produces. So again, it's this sort of uninterest in engaging with aspiration and affluence en total that I think is the issue there. So again, to concur with, I think, what both again Dianne and Rachel were saying about New Labour, I think in its adoption of a more nuanced attitude to aspiration from 1994, New Labour deserves a lot of credit. You know, the suburban middle class is once again famously reclaimed as our people in Blair's famous speech in 1995. And aspiration can be spoken of now as something that potentially to be in harmony with social conscience. Blair has that catchphrase, you can be successful and you can care. It's a simple one, but it kind of sums up that synthesis of the two things. And I think there is a growing academic consensus now around the idea of there being sort of two New Labours. So early New Labour, very intellectually vibrant, and then you get sort of progressively, as with any government that sustains itself in power over a long period of time, and usually for the Labour Party, you begin to get kind of intellectual fatigue. And what Blair, of course, does very effectively is this third way kind of synthesis, you know, rights and responsibilities, toughen crime, toughen causes of crime, and so on. By the end, I think the big problem for Blair is that he's almost losing his own third way. He's tilting away from the balance. It's all about the virtues of the market and not about what the collective kind of enabling side can do. So it's that balance, I think, on aspiration, you know, the collective and the individual, that works. And so New Labour itself loses perhaps that balance by the end. So I think sort of moving towards what the more kind of optimistic side and what can be done in the future. If Labour has had that problem with aspiration, it is also true to say that periodically it has, at its most successful moments, 1945, 1964, 1997, it has managed to address the issue of aspiration. It has captured it. And it's no coincidence, I think, that when it's done that, it's been at its most electorally successful. So, famously, the Attlee government of 45 to 51 grafts socialism onto kind of neoliberalism, has that kind of fusion of individual responsibility with opportunities, and the acceptance of the Beveridge report, of course, this idea that you pay into contributions and you get something out of it, but then you also have things like the National Health Service, which have provided the sort of socialist bit as well. And the language of the party leaders at that time is a very aspirational one. We shall encourage those who earn their money by hard work and ability. And I think a lot of this aspect of kind of responsibility, opportunity, aspiration is there in the Labour tradition. It's not always vocalised, it's not always kind of foregrounded in a lot of writing of the party's history, but it is there, and it's been an important part. It's very much there in 64 again. Rachel mentioned Roy Jenkins, warning colleagues in 59. Jenkins talks about a misplaced feeling that the Labour Party is a narrow class party, representing only the working class, and it's therefore natural for those who are beginning to do well in life to move away from it. And that was 60 years ago. It seems in many ways very, very prescient. And of course, then what Howell Wilson does so successfully is sort of blend these different moods. So you've got the socialism, you've got the planning, you've got the egalitarianism, but you also have this kind of zeitgeist emphasis on science, on cutting edge, on technology, on meritocracy. And if there are tensions, you know, it's fashionable to write a lot about critiques of meritocracy, between meritocracy and equity, those tensions are quite subtle ones, philosophical ones. And what Wilson did so successfully, and of course Blair is showing, you know, you can kind of fudge some of those tensions, you know, but you bring them together, and you speak to the aspirational, you speak to suburbia at the same time. And I think the lessons there as well for, and I'm conscious of shutting up now because I've spoken more than anyone. Perhaps you have to speak longer than me, Nathan. Is that maybe aspiration can be a bridger of some of these apparently intractable, you know, pulling together of these diverse sides of the country that seems like an almost kind of unsolvable problem. You have Scotland, you have Middle England, you have the sort of Red Wall. How on earth do you bring those different things together? And I guess maybe what Joe Biden showed, what these different Labour figures showed in 45, 64 and 1997 was that, you know, if you have an intellectually credible agenda, if you're well led, if you have a kind of vision that is speaking to aspiration and to equity, some of these apparent kind of contradictions, they do begin to melt away, and they seem not quite so intractable or unsolvable as they have perhaps done a few years earlier. So aspiration is not the only answer, and of course there are difficulties in terms of, you know, translating what aspiration actually means into hard policy. And I said I don't have the answers to that, but I think aspiration is one of the answers. And it's encouraging that Keir Starmer has begun to talk quite a bit about some of these things like opportunity and aspiration. So, thank you.
I mean, I assume that everybody knows it, but, you know, he edited the book, the most important book written in the early 90s. He was in the RBA, and was executive director of Progressive Britain and co-director of Labour to Win.
Hero.
And a hero.
Hero.
And a hero.
Thank you very much.
So thanks, Dianne, and also to Rachel, and very importantly to Jeremy for coming and speaking tonight. I was really keen for Jeremy to take part in the book and to come and speak to you this evening. From our early conversations about the book, and I'll go into the genesis of the book a bit later, is the conversation I had with Jeremy really made me realise that the aspiration really is a golden thread that we have to acknowledge runs through the history. It's Y-E-O-W-E-L-L. There really is a golden thread that runs through the Labour Party. And actually, if you start thinking, if you acknowledge the fact we are now 130 years old, the importance of aspiration is much greater than it would have been 30 years ago, because obviously we are 130 years old now. And aspiration was front and centre of the project that was in place in the 1990s. We didn't call it as such, but it was front and centre of what we did in the 60s and the 40s. So actually, I think it's really important. I said that Jeremy took part in the book, but it was really important for me. It came at the end, and that actually it comes as those who haven't read the book, just nod along if you agree with me if you have read it. It basically starts drawing together some of the things in the rest of the book, and actually it's very interesting from an academic point of view that Jeremy does give us some marching orders about where the direction he thinks that the Labour Party could go to and marshal and utilise aspiration as a policy tool more effectively than perhaps we have done. So thank you very much, Jeremy. This is a really good you've done. Because also it's a shame that Rachel couldn't stay, but I thought it was the interplay between what Rachel was trying to pull off and achieve in her brief as Shadow Chancellor, that actually what Jeremy's talked about has to be front and centre of what we do in appealing to the country, in appealing to people's aspirations and their desire for actually greater opportunity for themselves and their families and their communities. Because quite frankly, if we're not like that, we really need seriously to think about why we're here. So obviously, I'm going to talk through a couple of things. I'm talking a bit more about the book itself. I'm going to talk a bit about why we've done the book, and then I'm going to talk you through why I think, sort of taking back on the Rachel way, talking through why I think some of the insights in the book and actually greater understanding and a proper understanding of our history really do provide foundations that the Labour Party could utilise to really go forward and win the future with Keir and Rachel and with others in the next couple of years. So essentially the book, I'm biased, it is a remarkable collection of essays. It really is, but I'm not joking, folks. If you look at it, there are 22 contributors. And it includes some of the best Labour historians working in the UK today, as well as a number of up-and-coming young academics who've written some exciting chapters for us, plus Rachel, plus Nick. I think I want to put on record my gratitude to everyone for taking part, because basically, most of them got a phone call or email from a random individual they'd never met or heard of before, like two months into lockdown in 2020. And basically, within 12 months, we turned around a very impressive project. It was originally going to be 6 2,000-word blogs, and it might have been easier for everyone concerned. I left it at that. In the end, it's become over 100,000 words. I think it provides a lot of ammunition for me to in the future. So the topics cover a range of subjects Dianne's mentioned. There are essays on Tony Blair, and asking people to start taking a different view on him, to understand there is not just one Tony Blair at one fixed point in time, but like all of us, there are many Tony Blairs, and at different points in Tony Blair's career and his political trajectory, he expresses and proposes different things, and actually calls on us to take that view according to what we think about him. There is an article by Glenn O'Hara, basically asking questions about, is it time to re-evaluate Harold Wilson? Now, that question has been posed at least every 2 or 3 years since the early 1990s when Ben's book came out. But I think it was very interesting. If you were to ask somebody for their view on Harold Wilson in 2010, it would be a much less sympathetic view than it might have been in 2020, us having gone through the last 10 years. I'm not saying that holding the Labour Party together in the way in which he did it was a terribly honourable thing, but if you look at it, actually keeping the Labour Party together, keeping us in Europe, winning an election in the mid-1970s with the promise of social and industrial peace, which he managed to succeed for a couple of years, does put in the failures of prime ministers and party leaders the past 10 years into perspective. There's a chapter about Anthony Crosland's later work in the 1970s, specifically, by Patrick Diamond, specifically about his book of essays, Socialism Now, not totally favoured at the time, let alone thought about much in the site, but basically asking us to go back and look at it to see, is there anything that Crosland wrote about, writing about environmentalism, writing about trying to grow the economy in an age of stagflation, that potentially might say something to policymakers today? Because quite frankly, we have ignored those writings for 30 years because post-1980s and definitely post the fall of the Berlin Wall, we just assumed that those policy prescriptions were not relevant to the world that we live in. There are also very interesting essays about the intellectual development of theory and of thought around the Labour Party. So Florence Braithwaite is here from UCL, who wrote a chapter with her colleagues as the editors of Renewal, that's Emily Robinson, who sends her apologies, she's not able to come tonight, and also George Morris, talking about the intellectual trajectory and the evolution of Renewal as a source of Labour Party thinking. We have 2 other authors here. Nick Garland, who was just completing, promises me, his PhD in the very near future. Nick has written a chapter about the importance of place and community and theories of community within the Labour Party as a point of contention at times with the municipal localist view we've taken. We've also got this Professor Rowan McWilliam from Anglia Ruskin, who with his colleague John Davis has written a reappreciation of Kinnock, which I think is very interesting, trying to posit him in a continuum with other revisionist projects, social democratic projects in the 1980s outside the UK. I think there's an awful lot in there, and it's not just the usual suspects writing about the usual topics, so they're not all hard back. But we do have a limited number of copies of the book that you can sell at a discounted price of £15 at the end of the meeting. So that's me, I can now myself let them carry on. So essentially, writing around the book. On the 5th of April 2020, refreshing my browser, waiting for that very staged video of Keir Starmer to flicker on the screen, looking like a hostage victim, telling us that he was very pleased, well, maybe he knew what was coming, telling us that he was pleased to have been elected leader. I came across a tweet from Professor David Edgerton. Now, David is a professor of modern Earth history at King's College London, and is best known, I guess, the last couple of years for writing what is a very impressive book about a revisionist account of British history in the 20th century. But he wrote thus: British politics has an intimate relationship to history, not least Labour politics, but is often a version of history that never really happened. In order to generate fresh thinking about policy, Labour has to free itself from the shackles of its own invented history. That really struck a chord with me. I mean, obviously, we've just come through our no bones about it. I just spent the best part of the last 5 years in faction fights down trenches trying to delegitimise political arguments that were being thrown at me from across the West End. But I'm consciously aware of the way that I use some political, the interplay between political narrative and political history is not always a precise one. But it did make me realise that if actually Keir had taken, the beginning of getting into a position of sanity in the Labour Party, we had to do some thinking and do that thinking quite quickly about actually how do we also revive an intellectual project or intellectual activity on what was the moderate or the mainstream of the Labour Party. And it struck me that David's quote provides me with an opportunity to go away and think about how actually history can provide us with that. I think one of the other things that was very important for me was the extent to which political arguments in the Labour Party have become quite ahistorical. Both Rachel and Dianne have mentioned, not so I've mentioned before, we've ended up going through the last couple of years being told that everything, every whipstitch, baggage activity post-1997 was the work of the devil, and therefore could not be celebrated, should not be promoted. I mean, this started before 2015, people have to remember many of us sort of sleepwalked into what happened thereafter. But actually we've had people on the left of the party, or people who joined the party since 2014-15, coming in telling us that we were illegitimate and that all our actions and activities were wrong. We've also had, it comes back to my political narrative point, and I understand why we used the narrative in 1994, the decision to jump everything that came before and put it into a box marked Old Labour, which might have made sense at the time, and historiographically might have made sense at the time. I think with the march of time was a mistake. I think we need to get in a position where we do not follow and fall into false binaries. It's not about biggies and baddies and my side versus your side all the time. We have to be able to broker what are contested interpretations of Labour's past if we are to secure the present and move forward to the future. And what's more important for me, and this is what I've read in the introduction, instead of breaking it down into 5-yearly chunks of where we lost and then when we lost and then when we probably lost again, it's to start thinking, it's not that much cheery, I'm just amalgamating blocks of time where we lost. But actually, if we take a step back and think about how we cut the last 120, 130 years differently and take a different view of the span of Labour's history. So actually what I've done, and the period's not mine necessarily, Ben Jackson, that Rachel mentioned, also Ross McKibben in Oxford, and also John Wilson, who's an academic at King's, have written about these periods before. If you break it down, I've broken down the last 120 years into 3 phases, and each of them is underpinned by a different intellectual foundation in terms of the ideological continuum of the Labour Party. I think to talk you through it briefly, I think it gives us a bit of an idea of actually what the Labour Party has been about, and actually potentially if we can synthesise those views, what we can be about together in the future. So the first period, from Farringdon Hall until 1931, so Farringdon Hall when the party was established until 1931, when the curtain really came down on the early Labour Party and Macdonald's decision to go and form a national government with Baldwin. I think essentially you can characterise as being a period actually not based on the last conflict. Class war as such as existed in this country was done specifically by the trade union movement. It was supported by Labour Party politicians, but in terms of the intellectual currents that sustained the party, particularly the leaders of the parliamentary Labour Party, that first period was characterised by a project of social transformation rooted in the idea of community and greater fellowship and how we grow. And national fellowship is the ideal way of running the country. Very much an ethical socialist interpretation of contemporary society and a desire to promote that. That was very much the view taken by Ramsay MacDonald. And it's very interesting when you start looking at the critiques of what we had done in government in the 1920s. There was no alternative economic ideology or strategy that was put forward by the Labour Party going against what was then a sort of free trade orthodoxy in the 1920s. It was very much about actually the concept of ethical socialism in the community. I think 1931 definitely, I said, brought the curtains down on that one, because anything that was associated with the trades of MacDonald was thrown out of the window and we started again. The next period then, from 1931 and 1979, both bookended by defeats. I mean, there are more of them coming, so it's like, I'm not giving the game away too much. Essentially, it's the period where Labour has enjoyed the longest period of time actually running in the country. So an 11-year block, the wartime coalition after 1940, going into Attlee's government in 1951, then the Wilson governments in the 60s and the Callaghan governments in the 70s. more, and we've yet to beat that, essentially. We've only had those 13 years since 1979, let's remember that. I mean, that period is characterised by three complementary themes. It's actually conversion to economic theory as the underpinning of political activity, so very much moving against what had been the orthodoxy of the Labour Party under Baroness and Nuttall. Be that Keynesianism, be that nationalisation, be that greater forms of economic planning. It was a commitment to different ways of organising the British economy that actually led to the promotion of Labour Party activity. It also, that came part and parcel with the rise and the eventual fall of Labourism as a form of expression of political activity in this country, and it was and then the Labour Party's legitimisation as a result of that. If you hark back, those of you who were there, there's probably nobody. The bringing in of the trade union movement in the form of Ernest Bevin in the 1940s, the Wartime Coalition, really is one of the most significant events in the Labour Party's history. It brought him straight into the heart of government, in charge of coordinating manpower and labour during the Second World War, and by bringing him, the most important trade union leader of the day, into the heart of government, it legitimised the trade union movement in the way that the Conservatives had not been willing to recognise before, and it also legitimised the Labour Party as the political expression of that organisation. And quite frankly, that held true until the late 1970s. Admittedly, in the 70s, it was creaky by 1979, basically. Increasing problems between government and party, the rule of the 1970s essentially then brought that system to a close. But I think essentially those 40 years, those 50 years rather, are very important. So I think as Keynes is the guide, this is when Labour set a course to building the New Jerusalem. And unlike earlier incarnations of British socialism, this was actually a New Jerusalem that we built with bricks and with mortar, not through thoughts of personal and political transformation. And you can see that in the 40s and the 60s and the 70s, in new houses built in new towns, in new colleges and new universities and in hospitals in these towns. This was the new Britain. It was a Britain that we were building. As Rachel said, with hindsight at least, we were building a nation. We were not fomenting class war. I think that's one of the things to take away. Now, Labour's third age, and this is where I said that defeats are coming back again. This is also again then bookended by defeats in 1979 and 2019. Hands of Mrs Thatcher in 2019 and of Boris Johnson in 2079, rather than Boris Johnson in 2019. The period includes Blair and Ryan governments. Dianne's nicked my quote, but it is, as I said, it is the longest period of successful government we've ever had. But it also includes some of the darkest periods of rancour and internecine factional warfare that we've ever had in the early 1980s and again in the mid-2010s rather. I think the successes after 1997 should very much be seen as reactions to the disasters and the failures of the early 80s, quite frankly. By the middle of the 1980s, when we were over the hump, maybe by 1987, but actually we had proved that we were a contestable political party again, because it was a pretty close-run thing in the mid-1980s. I think Labour's debates were framed by the long-term decline of democratic, socialist and electoral forces across the world. I think revitalisation came in the form of engagement with ideas around constitutional reform, about environmentalism and new enthusiasm for Europe. As Patrick Diamond has written, not in this collection, but in his history of New Labour and the governments that was very much recommended, that came out in 2020. But essentially, Patrick has referred to there being a multitude of ideas from diverse sources and intellectual traditions from the late 1980s through to the 1990s that served as a springboard into government in the late 1990s and sustained us. I think the transformation of the global economy, Mrs Thatcher's systematic exclusion of organised labour from 1980-81 onwards, and the collapse of communism at the end of the 1980s sort of catalysed a revival of non-Marxist, values-based socialism that was authored, that anchored rather in welfare systems, in mixed economies and in democratic institutions. That is why we did what we did in the 1990s, essentially. Government, the history of our party, the history of all parties is contextualised and is contextual. Part of the problem I think I've had with certain voices in the past 10 years, and even some more contemporary critiques of what we should do in the Labour Party, some people seem to take a view, but if I don't like X, I can just ignore it or decide to turn the clock back. Well, unfortunately, the world does not. We can't do that, comrades. It's a shame sometimes we but also we need to be aware of the context of the times in which we're operating. So that's why it's so crucial, I think both Dianne and Rachel mentioned it, of actually what we're living through at the moment. We don't know yet. The outbreak of war in Ukraine could be potentially the most significant effect on the Labour Party and contemporary society since the last one, which is COVID. I mean, joking aside, the issue is the crashes that are hitting us at the moment. We do not know how the country or the party is going to react, or indeed what the country needs from us as a political party to operate in that system. I think we have to be ready to change who we are again, and to do that hard thinking and that heavy lifting to ensure that we become the party that best serves the interests of everyone in this country. So in closing, I was to talk about why I think there is insight in the book and insight from academic historians about history that we should we should take on board and think about. So now we're now in the fourth age. I mean, it sounds all a bit sort of Tolkien-esque, so we're almost at the end of the appendices, I promise. So I think basically, if to succeed, we have to address and then answer some fundamental questions. Who do we speak for? And critically, to what end? I mean, and what do we do if our overtures to the hard-working people of Britain are not reciprocated? We can't just shout hard, we can't just shout louder and expect them to decide on what's listening to. I think we need to decide what intellectual and ideological themes that we want to pursue. We need to agree between ourselves those that we want to reject. We must refine and champion a new, progressive and social democratic vision of life in the 21st century. I think engaging the past is the surest route to owning that future. Shouldn't live in the past, we have to learn from it. So essentially, that's the big idea of the book. So essentially, I have three thoughts to help us process. I think first, I think it's very encouraging that Keir has already, much of my introduction has actually been last summer, so obviously Keir's been listening, reading the early script I wrote. I think it's vital that Labour ditches the them and us rhetoric of the past decade. And we have to move away, like I said before, from binary and antagonistic political positions in favour of a nation-building political project. We must be ebullient, we must be optimistic, we've got to be aspirational. Secondly, I think our fourth age gives us a platform for the intellectual renewal that we undertook in the 1980s and 90s and we undertook in the 1930s. I think this should be anchored in a belief in community, thus looking at the hallmarks of that first stage. A revitalised economic and I think crucially environmental theory, which links us back to some of the underpinnings of that second age. And really we need to reaffirm our enduring commitment to social policy and welfare provision. We need to rescue the phrase social security. It should be a lifelong guarantee to everybody in the country that needs it at whatever point in time they need that support, not a byword for a broken system of welfare. I think our mission must be national renewal, but that starts with the local. I think deep in our DNA, before some of the centralising tendencies in 1945, was municipal pride and a commitment to services delivered locally and democratically. I think that is one of the things, as an organisation, Progressive Britain is very much in favour of. I think David Miliband wrote, I think he was or he spoke at least in the Keir Harding lecture in 2010. Default statism turns citizens into consumers and makes government a giant problem solver, which only increases our technical managerialism. We need a democratic revival, and we need to reward active citizenship. I think this is key, not only to economic revitalisation and social reconstruction, but also to electoral revival. Lastly, we need some big ambitions, and not, as in 2019, ambitions that were quite frankly so absurd and outlandish that they provoked ridicule. But we need to be bold enough to show that we understand the scale of the challenges. We can construct a coalition committed to tackling the deep-seated inequalities in communities and between different parts of the country, which the pandemic has so cruelly revealed. I think this is the moment for Labour, drawing on its rich history, but fixed on its future, to deliver the leadership that this country so badly needs and deserves. With that, I will sit down.
We've got about 15 minutes. Normally people say, oh, we have questions, but actually I think this time we want comments and input and thoughts. So I don't think we need to try and twist what you want to say in
John, you're a member of the Fabian Society. I just wondered what lessons we have to learn from our sister parties on the continent, bearing in